That would be nice as well. But right now, let's go on to something else, something very, very different. We have two examples of this in Essex, to my knowledge, and that is where a major employer builds a town for the workforce. Not only houses, but also all the entertainment facilities and so on. It's a weird thing which possibly employers wouldn't do today, but we're going to look at two examples of where they have most definitely done this in Essex in the past. We're going to look at East Tilbury, Barter Town, and we're going to look at Silver End, Crittall Town. Well, building an entire town for your workforce to live and socialise in is quite an unusual phenomenon, and one that is increasingly rare, but they do exist. You've got Bourneville in Birmingham, Saltaire in West Yorkshire, Concert in County Durham, and of course we've got two examples right here in Essex with East Tilbury and Silver End. Well, this morning we're going to take a look at the history of these two so-called company towns, how they came about, what it was like to live there, and what the future of them is. We'll start in the south of the county, in East Tilbury, which was turned from a small number of dwellings to a reasonable-sized town as a result of the Czechoslovakian Bata Shoe Company. I've been down there to take a look around the town with the chairman of the Bata Reminiscence And Resource Centre, Mike Tarbard, as my guide. Well, we're on the actual site now of the factories, and we're standing outside a building that actually looks pretty modern. It looks as though it's been recently renovated and painted. What was this?
Well, this building originally, when it was first built, was the first factory where shoes were made, and then when the leather factory and rubber factory were built, it became the administration block and remained as such until the factory closed down.
Right, it's almost like a university campus, this, isn't it? Lots and lots of different buildings on one area.
Well, it is, and where we're standing, we can see the whole site, and just certainly to our left, there's a disused building there, which is quite a large building, and just to let you know, that was what they called the electronic data processing or computer department. Now, I reckon the laptop that we've all got at home today has probably got more power than that computer had in its day.
Entire building.
Yes.
That entire building. Well, look, let's go inside this, what was the original factory and also the administration block. Let's walk inside now and take me through. We're going through the doors. When would this have been built?
This was probably built around 1933. 34, probably 33.
And you can tell, can't you, all flat roofs everywhere. It's very block design.
It is. It's what I think they call the modernism style or Bauhaus style of architecture, which the whole estate is based on.
And we walk through a second door and we're into a reception area, and there's lots of sort of feet on the wall.
Yeah, they're lasts of various shoes, mainly boots, I think, that the company would have used here to produce their boots. There's riding boots and ordinary walking boots. My understanding is that when the company closed down, the new owners found these in a skip. Fortunately, they recovered them and then restored them and then have hung them on the wall, and it's a lovely feature.
And over on the right-hand wall here, almost a sort of history of the Bata factory in pictures and words. Maybe you could take me through that history. Why did they choose this site in this county for a factory?
Well, first of all, Thomas Bata wanted to expand his Czech empire to Britain, and that's when he bought the land from Farmer Wilson, the local potato farmer, in 32. I think the main reason was communication, because there were, back in those days, I guess, relatively good roads. The river was very close by. He originally bought 600 acres, which spread right up to the river. And on the original plans, I think that we've got, which are, well, I say original plans dated 1947, there was going to be a small airport, which he would have then flown in from Zlin in Czechoslovakia to here. It was a bit unfortunate. He bought this land in March 1932, and then July 1932, Thomas Bata was flying from Zlin in Czechoslovakia to Moulin in Switzerland to open a new factory. He and the pilot took off in fog, and unfortunately the plane crashed and they were both killed. So he never ever saw his idea come to fruition, but the family did.
So the family took this on, and what was their plan? Take me through their sort of vision, because this was a copy of their other factories, wasn't it?
You're right, David. It certainly was a copy of the factories in Zlin. Thomas Bata, I understand, was a great friend of Henry Ford. So he went out to the States to see Henry Ford and see how they produce cars and the conveyor system. And they brought in the conveyor system here to East Tilbury. And it was one of the very first to come into this type of factory. Thomas Barter's vision was to shoe the world at an affordable price. So if you look back into the 70s and the sort of shoe companies, or shoemaking companies, I should say, that were around, the Clarks, the Lilly and Skinners, Free and Hardy Willis, Dulce's, Barter's and whatever, Barter's was probably at the lower end of that scale because they were much cheaper and people could afford them.
What did it mean for the local community there? It must have been incredible, all this work suddenly arriving, but of course it must have been fairly specialist work, wasn't it?
I think it was probably became specialist, but when he opened up in 1933, 34 time, people came from far and wide because it was the Depression time, which was a good reason for him coming here, and it was the reason why he was able to convince, or the local rector I should say, was able to convince the government to waive the idea of the potato quota, to allow the factories to be built to give the workforce or potential workforce to come here. One of the other things that didn't exist, the railway line, I think it was at that time run by London Midland Region, came through East Tilbury, but there was no railway stop here. The nearest one was at Low Street. But Barter spoke to the railway company, and in 1935, a new railway station at East Tilbury was opened.
They must have been incredibly persuasive people.
They certainly must have been, you're absolutely right.
And also, these days, everything takes so long to do, but they did this so quickly, didn't they?
Well, they did, and I think it was a very simple style of building. It was steel, there were concrete pillars, and I guess criddle-style windows put in, which I guess must have had a lifespan of maybe 30, 40 years. So they were built in 1933, 34, and here we are in 2014. The buildings, as you mentioned, Dave, are still here. Some not quite a good state as others, but they're still here.
We're going to have a wander around in just a few moments' time, but looking still at the concept, he was the family were very keen on that sort of paternalistic view. They wanted to make sure the workers lived in decent accommodation. They wanted to make sure the workers had good facilities, didn't they?
That's right. Here at East Tilbury, there was everything for us. There were houses were being built. The first houses were built in 1933, 34, based upon Zlin, flat roof, and gradually the housing stock got built, pre-war and post-war, and it ended up something like 300 odd houses that they had in total. But as well as that, there was a hotel which initially housed the male employees who didn't have accommodation. There were 2 hostels that housed the single women. As people got married and housing was built, they were applied for and they could be allocated a house. We're just looking at the photographs here, as you mentioned, Dave, and I can see on it there's some tennis courts laid out and the open-air swimming pool, which was opened in 35. And this picture we're looking at was probably late 1930s, so they got their priorities right about getting the sporting side of it.
So everything was here, wasn't it? But of course, over the years, things changed. At one time, I believe on their production line, it was between 30 and 40 people that a shoe went through or a Wellington boot went through before it was finished. And then, of course, it was computerised many years later, wasn't it?
I think that's right. And the big problem that Barter had really was the cheap importation of shoes, which is why we saw the demise of the company here at East Tilbury. Barter, though, still exists across the world. I think it's right to say that they're in 90 countries, largely in the far east, the far west of Europe. No, it's wrong, far east of Europe. Into the far east, Singapore, Pakistan, India, Australia, New Zealand, and even in the Russias, I believe.
Why did it finish here? Because it was, I think the last shoes were, 2005?
As I say, it was cheap importation. They just couldn't compete with the salaries that were being paid out particularly in the Far East, where their factories were in existence and still are today.
We're walking up the main thoroughfare through the Barter factories here. The administration building latterly is on our right there. On our left, what was that building over there, Mike?
The first building is the leather factory, and beyond it is the rubber factory. And just on the corner on our right here, where there's vehicles are, that was their fire station. They had their own fire brigade, like many of the local industrial companies had.
And I believe that the place also had its own newspaper.
That's right. It started 80 years ago this year in 1934. It cost 1 old penny, whatever that is in modern day terms, and it remained a penny and a new penny throughout until the company closed down. It was edited in-house, produced in-house, and sold on-site by teenagers as I was at the time.
So you used to flog the newspaper. Tell me about that.
Well, I certainly did. There were probably about 6 of us each week on a Friday. We'd go into the administration block and we'd be assigned a particular area, and however number of newspapers we had, we were put on our arm. And in the old days, Dave, of when it was an old penny, if we had 250 newspapers on our arm and then ended up with 250 coppers in our pocket, it was quite heavy.
Yeah, you're slightly lopsided, were you?
Exactly.
Now, we've walked up, we've passed the leather factory, and now we have the rubber factory on our left, which looks, I have to say, the building looks a little sad now. Again, it's a 5-storey, isn't it?
That's right, it is. It's in need of a lot of work, but it's about the money to do it, I think. That's the real problem. And just up on our right, Dave, you'll see here a brick-built building, which was the boiler house. The chimney has now gone from it.
Right. And in the rubber factory, what were they just healing and soling the shoes there, or what?
Well, no, we'd be making rubber shoes. That's where the boots were made.
Right.
And obviously, most shoes had leather soles, so they would have been produced solely in the leather factory. But there were lots of items that were Wellington boots, rubber boots, anything like that was rubber constituent would be made in this factory here.
Right on the top of it is the only sign I can see that Barter was actually ever here, the last Barter sign on top of that building. How much do local people actually know about their history nowadays?
I think they know probably quite a lot, Dave, because although we, the Bata Reminiscence Group, are in the library and we try to promote it through the library. We have open days twice a year, which all the locals know about, and we advertise it. But certainly I know in the local school here, the children, as part of their education, do social history. And that social history will include where they live, what was here, what Barter did for the community, so that they are aware of the history of East Tilbury.
And is that important?
I think it's vital, because without this company here, being here in the 1930s, what would have been here before this factory? Probably about 20 houses and nothing more. So it brought an amount of good to the area. It brought loads of employees. It brought happiness.
Because it's easy to forget that Barter didn't just make shoes. They made everything, didn't they?
That's right, Dave. They made everything connected with the shoes. They made shoe polish, they made laces, stockings, they made the whitener for plimp soles that we had in those days.
Oh, yeah.
They made the boxes for the shoes to go in. They made the cardboard boxes that the boxes of the shoes went in. They even made all the equipment for their own shoe shops, so it was standardised. They were very much self-contained.
And so everything was done here, and factories like this, I suppose, were?
Well, that's right. They had other factories around the UK. Specifically, there was one up in Maryport in Cumbria, and others up in Scotland. They had about 4 or 5 other outlets in the UK at the time.
Now, we're walking past the front of what was the first factory and then the administration building, and a very proud statue of the man who made it all happen.
That's right. This is the statue to Thomas Barter. It's a bronze statue. I understand it was taken out to Zlin in Czechoslovakia, where they copied it. And we're never too sure if this was the original or the copy that came back. We think it was the original. But it is, as I say, made in bronze, and it's still here.
Thomas Barter, 1876 to 1932. So sad that he made it all happen, but he never saw the results.
I think that's right, but he clearly had a great vision, and that vision carried on for 70 odd years.
I tell you, Mike, what really strikes me, there are so many trees, there are so many plants. The planting is lovely. There are lovely hedges everywhere. I mean, this was all part of the dream, wasn't it? This was all part of the whole.
That's right. Certainly when I grew up here as a child, every avenue was tree-lined. There were cherry blossoms and those sorts of plants all around. And here we are, Dave. We're standing outside what is now East Tilbury Village Hall, which was the cinema, built in 1935. Open many times a week, most evenings, I think, from memory. Certainly Saturday mornings was Kids Club. Certainly I can remember there with my Tanner in my hand to go in and watch the latest Lassie, Rawhide, or whatever was appropriate at the time.
And do you remember going along there? Did you to the actual evening performances? What sort of films can you remember seeing in there?
Well, I suppose things were, like in those days, Quatermass and those sorts of things. But one of the other things, just digressing slightly from films, that took place here was Workers' Playtime, which you may remember.
Yes, from the BBC, Workers' Playtime they did here. This is a perfect thing for Workers' Playtime, isn't it? Because you had it all on site.
Well, that's right. It was done at lunchtime. We understand you had to apply for a ticket, so as workers you would come over here at lunchtime and you can see the Workers' Playtime. It was recorded here live. I believe it was 2 or 3 times it was recorded here, but that was quite something. And the other thing, if I can just mention, and it wasn't necessarily Barter related, but in the hotel and in the ballroom there was a charity event, I think it must have been back in the 60s, and Sir Tom Jones appeared here.
Well, actually, looking from the cinema to the Barter Hotel, not only did Tom Jones appear in that ballroom, so did I.
Well, what can I say?
So you're speechless, aren't you?
I'm totally speechless.
Let's walk along, because this was in front of us, the Barter Hotel, and I have memories of that. As I say, I did discos in here, I think, a couple of times. Tell me about the history of the hotel.
Well, this was built originally to house the male employees, or single employees, who came to work for Barter. The single ladies, as I mentioned a little earlier, were in the hostels in Barter Avenue. But certainly on the first floor there was a canteen that I think they could serve up to 600 people at lunchtime.
Wow.
The second floor and third and fourth were all accommodation for workers and visitors from Barter worldwide. The Barter family had their own flat, which, if we look up in this top corner, Dave, just on the right hand side here with the small window, that corner there was where the Barter family had their flat. There was a gymnasium up there. Very restricted access to, though.
And shops underneath?
Yes, there were always shops underneath. There was a supermarket with its butcher, there was a post office, and there was their shoe shop as well.
And right opposite, beautifully positioned, are some flat roof, wonderful Art Deco Barter houses. Shall we walk across there?
Yes, let's do that. It's Barter Avenue.
Let's conclude our tour now around East Tilbury, a town that was virtually built by the Czech company Bata, the shoe company, for its workers to live in. I was shown around the key locations of the town by Mike Tarbard from the Bata Reminiscence And Resource Centre. Now, Mike's parents met whilst working for the company in the 1950s, and I think there's a lot of stories out there similar to that, where people actually met at that factory. Mike's final place to show me was Barter Avenue.
Just here was the Barter garage that sold petrol, did servicing of vehicles, and certainly serviced the Barter fleet of vehicles.
People had absolutely everything here, didn't they?
Yes, it was totally self-sufficient. I think, as you said to me earlier, Dave, you didn't have to move off the estate, really. The only two things that were not here: there was no church on the estate, there's no pub on the estate.
For a reason?
I don't know, maybe with the Czech backgrounds, maybe they thought it wasn't appropriate. But certainly there's a pub and a church at East Tilbury Village and at Linford, both close by.
And tell me about these houses that I can see on my left here. They're flat-roofed. They look like sort of barrack blocks, I suppose.
Well, these were the very first houses built by Barter here. It's in Barter Avenue. As you can see, it's tree-lined to a degree. They are, as you mentioned, flat-roofed, based on the modernism Bauhaus style of architecture. I think they were built in 1934, the very first houses that were built here. And they're on what we call the checkerboard style of building. So some have got a short front garden, then there's a long back garden. The next one's got a long front garden, short back garden. But the first two buildings, either side, we're looking left and right, they originally were hostels. So they would house the single women that came to work at Barter's. And so they could keep them away from the men who were in the hotel.
Why did he decide to do it in the sort of checkerboard style that you referred to?
Well, this was the style of architecture that existed in Zlin, and so he wanted to replicate the town of Zlin, which is many, many times bigger than East Tilbury, but he wanted to replicate the whole idea, so he would feel comfortable coming here, knowing that it was just like Zlin was.
Did they exchange staff very much around the world?
Well, they certainly did in the early days here, because Shoemaking, as you mentioned earlier, Dave, was very new here. They sent some Czech nationals over here to be the management of Bata when it first opened. And in return, they identified young British men, sent them out to Zlin to learn the trade of shoemaking, of management and so forth. And after their 2 or 3 year spell out there, they would come back and they would replace the Czechs that were here.
I wonder how the Czechs went down in East Tilbury when they first arrived. Can you imagine that? Because they must have been something quite exotic, mustn't they?
They integrated very well. And in fact, as a community, it became, I suppose, what we now know today as a multiracial society. Certainly post-war, as well as the Czechs here, there were lots of Poles, lots of Maltese. There were a lot of the Sikh community used to come across from Gravesend on the ferry and the train to work here at the factory. So, as I say, very much a multicultural society.
What happened when they left? What did people do?
Well, I think that was the problem. It became a big hole. A lot of people clearly lost employment, and so people had to go elsewhere, and the area of Thurrock was going through a bit of a bad time with employment, so I guess many people actually ended up on the dole, which was very sad to hear.
Now, you've been referring to the Reminiscence and Resource Centre. Tell me more about that.
Well, the group was formed about 12 years ago by two ladies, really, a lady called Winifred, or she's known as Fred Price, who worked here in the library, and a lady called Joan James, who unfortunately died a couple of weeks ago. And they saw something here that they could tell a story. The story starting off as reminiscences of the people who worked here at Bata. And over the years, that's got bigger and bigger. And so we have lots of reminiscences, lots of artefacts. And we still try to actually get those stories. There aren't that many people left who worked here, as you can imagine. But we had a lady visit us last Tuesday who worked here between 1943 and 1953. Her husband joined the company after the war. They met, they married. They told us the dates, and we could find in our records the joining details for both of them. And we also found in the Barter record, which we talked about a bit earlier, details of their marriage in 1954. So I thought it was a nice end to her visit to East Tilbury. What we're trying to do is continue this story of Barter to make sure people are aware of it. And certainly we've got a small band of 9 volunteers. We dearly would love more to come on board, because it does become hard work, particularly when we have events, open days and so forth, and when we go out and give talks to local groups.
Woke up cold one Tuesday. I don't need an excuse, 'cause I'm wearing my brand new shoes.
Palanatini and new shoes. Well, you think of a few shoe songs if you can. My thanks to Mike Tarbard, who's absolutely brilliant. So much information from the Barter Reminiscence and Resource Centre.